time that we're living through is that we've been forced to find means to carry on our communications online, and therefore we've started to be able to host meetings and by this kind of mechanism. And I'm staggered and delighted that we have here not only Oreo speaking from Brazil, but other delegates from Brazil. George, of course, is in Greece, and a number of you are in Greece too. I'm delighted to hear that one of you lives in Messalongi. I'm an enormous fan of Lord Byron, who, of course, died there. And we have people joining us from Norway, from Albania, from Germany, from the UK. So we're very pleased that at least in this difficult time, by this kind of medium, we can continue the Commission's activities and continue to work together and think together and talk together. I'm delighted to be able to introduce Ario, though, specifically, and thinking about opportunities for meeting. I remember very vividly a delightful conversation that Ari and I had together at a conference in Paris when we met through the CoSciLit meeting in Paris, what now seems an age ago. But hopefully we'll be able to resume those kind of meetings in person, as George says, before too long. So Ario is a PhD candidate at the University of Padua in the Department of Linguistics and Letters, and he's researching the interactions between literature, epidemiology, and the history of epidemic diseases, which makes him an ideal speaker for our series. His research project specifically is on cholera, so it's entitled Epidemic Cholera and the Literary Imagination in Europe, 1830 to 1912, but he's expanding on that theme today to talk on the wider topic of the plague and the mob, group identity and anonymity in literature from the Black Death to the Influenza Pandemic, so a rather wider span. I should add too that Ario has a master's degree from the University of Bologna in European literary cultures, where he did a thesis on the Divine Comedy by Dante, and he's published a number of papers. And of course, as I hinted, remembering our Paris meeting, he's participated actively too in the congresses organized by the Commission. So we're very delighted to have you, Ario. We're very, very pleased and looking forward to hearing your talk. And if I may, I'll now hand over to you. Very good to see you.
That's great. Thank you very much, John, for the presentation, and both of you, George and John, for the invitation and the Commission on Science and Literature. It is a huge pleasure to be here. When I saw the people participating in it, like Rebecca Totaro and Martin Willis, for example, he will be in a few months in my commission with when I present my PhD thesis. So it's a huge pleasure. And I've lived in Greece for a while, so I was particularly touched to speak with the Greek audience. I prepared a little note of thank you, and I had to write it down because my Greek would not allow me to improvise. So, πριν ξεκινήσουμε, θα ήθελα να σας ευχαριστήσω όλους στα ελληνικά. Έχω ζήσει 6 μήνες στη Θεσσαλονίκη ως φοιτητής Εράσμους. Και δυστυχώς μπορώ να μιλήσω πολύ λίγα ελληνικά, αλλά είμαι ευτυχής του επέστρεψα ακόμα και αν μέσω του δικτύου. Και σας ευχαριστώ πολύ για την πρόσκληση. Πάρα πολύ, George, and everybody. Thank you for the present. And I'm surprised actually to see that we have people from Norway, and thank you very much. It's an honor to speak to all of you. So let's start. Let me share my screen with you. Can you all see my screen? I cannot see the chat.
It's fine. No, it's fine.
Okay. So this is part of my PhD research that I'll be presenting today. And I'm focusing on the idea of anonymity versus individuality in a very wide spectrum of time, as John remarked. So let's start straight away, okay? Because I'm desperate to keep to the 45 minutes. So the first thing I would like to start with is about silence, actually, because diseases, they are a huge part of human life. I guess everybody figured out already that we're going to die eventually, and very likely that is going to happen due to disease. So everybody has been sick at some point. Everybody has fell ill. It is central. It is absolutely crucial to the human condition. But still, when we look into literature, what we find is not such a big thing. I mean, there are many texts which flirt with disease, that's true. But when we look into adultery, love, money, revenge, other themes, they in literature, they take such a much bigger length and a more extensive field. So I find it kind of remarkable that disease in literature, not only epidemics, but disease in general, is kind of underexplored, although there are numerous works discussing it. Even the plague, okay, the plague, the Black Death, which is actually the second plague pandemic, which did not happen only in Europe. It's a pandemic, so it happened all over the globe, although most historians focus solely on Europe. And it is the sole event in human history in which the global population decreased. So the only time in all of the history of humanity in which we stepped back. Okay, so this is huge. This is absolutely unique. We're talking about at least 40% of the population dying. Okay, at least. Some places in Italy have lost 60% of their population. So that is huge. That has many effects for economics, politics, culture, religion. Okay, so medicine. It's a huge phenomenon. And still, when we look into literature, yes, we have the Decameron. That's great, but still, the introduction of the Decameron is like 12 pages long. So, and then for all the other 800 pages, the plague disappears. Okay, so it's not really true that the Decameron is about the plague. It's not really. Okay, and if we look to other sources like contemporary sources, we find it a little bit in Chaucer, a little bit in Petrarch, like very indirect references, and that's all. So yes, we have Dances of Death and Danse Macabre and Triumphs of Death, that's true. But when we think on the scale of the event, literature actually has not really explored it at all, almost, okay? So this is something we have to keep in mind. But within this thematic world of disease, okay, within literature, we have this world of disease texts. I would propose we can roughly, okay, guys, in general terms, divide them in two major groups. Diseases of the individual and the diseases of the group. So when we look to a picture like this, Frida Kahlo's The Broken Column, we are reminded of the disease, a disease and a condition and an affliction of an individual. We can very much individuate Frida. We can, you know, at least 60% of her paintings are self-portraits. And in a huge number of them, she appears in a vulnerable position with frail health, abortions. She had many health issues, health problems during her life. And this image shows us that there are the problems with her. She had a problem with the spine. She had problems with the hips. She went through numerous surgical interventions throughout her life. We have the nails that go through her right leg, which was partially paralyzed by polio when she was 6. So it's very interesting because we're looking at a condition of one particular individual. So it's a very individualized, specific experience, but at the same time, we see a universal value in it. We all can dialogue with that. We all can grasp that in a certain sense because we all have felt that, and we all will eventually experience that again in our own bodies and in the bodies of the people we love, right? So that is a very potent image of an individual disease. And I know John will be happy now. If we think on Byron, I find this quotation very remarkable. I look pale, I should like to die of consumption, that is tuberculosis, because ladies would say, poor Byron, how interesting he looks in dying. So this shows to us that disease can be individualized to such a point that it becomes fashionable. It becomes a good thing. It's weird to think like that, but in a sense that is exactly what Byron is proposing here. He knows he is a bit provocative, but that's the idea also behind this sentence. But he's is wishing for a disease, and that's fascinating. So usually the diseases of the individual are equal to tuberculosis, several chronic conditions, madness, cancer, obviously. So it's a wide spectrum of diseases, and actually any disease can be portrayed as such. It's just that these ones they have a certain tendency to be represented in this way. And if we think about tuberculosis, TB, it's one of the major killers in the 19th century in Europe. So the disease has, if you were diagnosed with TB in the 1800s, you had a 50% chance of dying. Okay, 50%, and you would have on average 5 years to live. So TB back then is pretty much the way we culturally interpret cancer nowadays. Not all cancers are the same. Not all of them are deadly and awful, but still culturally, the cancer metaphors, they are linked to lethality. So they are linked to the idea of death itself. And that's pretty much how movies look into cancer. You see a character that has a cancer diagnosis, and he knows or she knows that they will die in a couple of months or a couple of years, and then they decide to enjoy life, right? Because if your time is counting, if you have only a few years to live, of course, you're gonna take out the better of it. So of course, you're gonna try to do great things to travel. And then the funny thing about tuberculosis is that the treatment was quite pleasurable, right? Unlike cancer therapy, you would be advised to go travel, go to Italy, enjoy art, lose yourself in the Louvre and stuff like this, right? I would not mind to be quarantined in the French Riviera or in a Greek island. I would not mind at all. Rather than my apartment. And so that was the standard treatment in the 19th century. And of course that this philosophical intake offers people an opportunity to reevaluate one's life. So people look behind and they value their achievements, and they decide what they will do in the next. So of course, diseases of the individual, they become philosophical. That's why literature has a preference for this type of representation. The individual diseases, they work as a frame, and they offer so much narrative potency to explore love stories, dead issues, whatever we want to put inside it. That's great. It works very well. So authors are truly fascinated by it. Okay, and we can see this in the very titles. Usually, these narratives are named after a person. So, Dombey and Son, for example, by Dickens, or La Dame aux Camélias, and see they're published very closely. We can see that in Italian literature, Mastro Don Gesualdo by Giovanni Verga. In these cases, they suffer from tuberculosis. And all of them die. Okay, Verga eventually will develop a cancer and will die from it as well. And by the end of the century, the same thing is true about the death of Ivan Illich. So you see, the disease is so individualized. We're not talking about tuberculosis per se. We're talking about these individuals and their sufferings. And that is very interesting, because if we think through it, disease does not exist. Disease is a cultural construct. That is very clear to anthropologists of health and anthropology of disease, because as long as coronavirus is out there, and it's not in a human being, as long as it's in the environment, it's not doing anything. So coronavirus, perhaps the virus is millennia old. I don't know. It could be like very, very old. The thing is that now, last year, 2 years ago, was the first time that it went into a human being. So COVID-19 only exists when you have a person involved. So you only have sick people. You only have sick individuals. Disease itself doesn't exist. It's a metaphorical entity. It's a metaphysical. We use it to talk. We use it to communicate. But malaria does not exist per se. Not yet. Neither yellow fever does. What we have is people sick with malaria. We have people ill of yellow fever, and etc. Okay, so this is very interesting, and it brings me to my next point. We're gonna think about that again in a moment. These individuals are very well defined, so much so that there is a very neat relationship, a very clear relationship between aristocracy and tuberculosis. You say Lord Byron, Count Dracula, okay, and now I gave it. I already broke into my next topic, which is vampires. Vampires are also related to TB. In this fascinating study, Tuberculosis and the Literary Imagination by Catherine Byrne, she shows how the descriptions of the literary vampires are very often based on medical treatises about tuberculosis. You know, the red lips, the cadaverous look, very pale, very thin. All of these are symptoms linked to TB. And that thing is also linked to aristocracy. So we have very, very defined individuals. And once again, what is the name of the novel? Dracula. So once again, it's a name, it's an individualized example. And so individualized, in fact, that it influences fashion, of all things. This is a fascinating study by Caroline A. Day called Consumptive Chic. And she looks into the history of culture, and her argument is that the 19th century marks a transition in our ideas about beauty. The desirable female body that was used to be plump, a little bit fat in the Enlightenment, and before slowly changes into the skeleton-like, the cadaverous, very, very thin bodies that we adore in contemporary culture. Okay, so she argues that tuberculosis is a key element within this transition, and fashion plays a huge role into the popularization of this new cultural trend. And if we think through the names of many fashion techniques or many attires, they are named after people, many of them, and usually these people were aristocrats. Okay, so because in the aristocracy, you distinguish yourself by inventing your own trend. And so fashion is all about being different. It's not about being equal. Okay, traditional dresses, folkloric dances, that is about being the collective, is about being anonymous within one tradition. But fashion is the complete opposite of that. Okay, so the fact that there is a link between tuberculosis and fashion really shows us, which is the point I'm putting forward today, which is this idea, the complex interaction between disease and identity, okay, or epidemics and anonymity. So now we shift into the second group, which is the group I study for my PhD, which is the diseases of the group. Okay, so epidemics, basically. Epidemics affect all members of society almost by definition. Okay, even if many people get sick at the same time, so that's the problem actually with COVID-19. If the rates of infection were much smaller, we would have the health system would be able to cope with the challenge. And so if what we're experiencing for the past year and a half were to be diluted in 2 decades, we would have, it would not be such a great challenge, actually, because we have to think that the mortality rate is kind of tiny as epidemics go. If it was Ebola, it would be like 80%. If it was bubonic plague as well. So actually, we have to feel thankful that 1 or 2% mortality rate is actually quite moderate. I don't want to of course, to lesser human suffering and but that's a point. I mean, the amount of human suffering would be so much bigger if we were talking about a more lethal disease. So epidemics, many people get sick at the same time, and this entails series of effects, a domino effect that affects politics, that affects economics. Of course, economics is brought to a halt. We have a collapse of several systems: the funerary system, the health system, school systems, etc. So imagine the kind of disruption that epidemics can cause in a society that has no mass media communication. Okay, when there's no internet, when there's no printing press. So we can imagine the profound effects that can have in the individual psyche and in the collective psyche. So much so that some historians link the Reformation, for example, to the experience of the plague 2 centuries before, because it was a huge delusionment to a cultural frustration with the church, because so many priests have actually deserted their flocks and then fled, and they died like everybody else. So it shows that they were not holy, and there are many interpretations like that. Okay, so they disrupt system, and that brings everyday life to a halt. All of us are experiencing some way or another, to some degree, the impact of coronavirus in our lives. Okay, that will vary, but we all are affected, and that's why epidemic diseases, they tend to be portrayed in art or in literature in this way. There's no particular character here. It's a triumph of death, but even death itself is not so easy to spot in here. So we see many skeletons which all symbolize death, and we see many people, even monarchs and popes and emperors, but they're not really distinguishable. The whole idea here is that this is a collective scourge. It's all anonymous. They're all the same. Okay. So in art, the epidemic, I know it's ambitious, but I think it's arguable. Okay. I think there is a tendency in art in general, not only in literature, for epidemic diseases, transmissible diseases, to be represented as a social rather than as an individual or biological affliction. So in Camus, La Peste, there is this very famous passage in which the narrator says that there are 2 types of plagues. There is the actual plague, the biological one, the one that kills you, and then there is the worst plague, okay, which is the metaphorical plague, which is the social plague, the one of the lack of compassion, the blaming, the scapegoating, the violence, etc. So this idea of 2 plagues walking side by side, one which is an actual disease and one which is actually is the effect of the disease in the first place. It's disease works here as a catalyzer to show hidden facets of the human psyche, and sometimes for good, very often for bad, as we are seeing. I'm in Brazil, guys, so you can imagine what we're in through the middle of a genocide in here. While the disease of the individual shows us a biological thing, the epidemics, they focus on the second idea. They focus much more on the social effects, up to a degree that sometimes they don't even mention what disease they're talking about. Sometimes they don't go through symptoms, very often actually. And narrators are rarely identifiable at all when we're talking about such diseases. For example, a Journal of the Plague Year, okay? It's narrated in first person by a guy called HF. He doesn't even have a name. It's just like letters. Of course, Defoe wishes we confuse this identity with the identity of his uncle, which was called Henry Foe. So he doesn't want to say that his uncle, that's the diary of his uncle, but he's kind of leading us to fall into that trap. And the thing about HF is that we know barely nothing about him. We know his profession, we know where he lives, and that's all, because he has to be anonymous. He has to be this voided character because he is the voice of London. He roams through the town during the Great Plague of London, and he witnesses many things, and he tells us the things that he sees. And so every paragraph or two, you read a different story, actually. So what you're actually reading is the life of the city, is not the experience of an individual, okay? The same thing holds true to some narratives that don't even have characters. So that is the case of the Danish writer Jens Peter Jacobsen, The Plague in Bergamo, which is a short story about the plague in Bergamo, and we don't even really have characters. It's focused on the city, and it's focused on the city and about wide phenomena. Okay, so and the same thing is also true about the camera in the first place, because when we think about the characters, their names, they're not real names. Philomena, Nephile, Philostrato, Pamphilo. Many of you are Greek, so for you is not a mystery at all that these names mean things. Loved one, the new love, defeated by love, all love. So Boccaccio is actually having a laugh with us. That these are not real people. They are all young, beautiful aristocrats, amazing, rich. And they spend these 10 days together, right? And they don't have a true identity. So much so that these kind of narratives are often named after a place. So all these narratives deal with cholera. I analyze all of them in my PhD, and they range from the 1830s. Dear Brooke is published in 1839 to the 1912, okay, to the early 20th century, Thomas Mann. And they all are named after a place, okay? So Deerbrook and Middlemarch, they are fictional towns in the English countryside, and Death in Venice, we're talking about Venice. But in all of them, we have cholera outbreaks, which are very, very significant for the development of the plot and of the characters. And in all of them, unlike the death of Ivan Illich or Mastro Don Gesualdo or La Dame Camilla, in all of these cases, we focus on the city, on the collective anonymous experience, okay? That is also true sometimes. Another variation on that tendency is to focus on disease itself. So I've mentioned diseases do not exist, if we want to argue that it is possible, but very, very many narratives are named after a disease, which shows us that they're not concerned about one individual patient. They're concerned about the collective experience. That is true about Jean-Paul Sartre's typhus, which was discovered a couple of years ago, was published in 2003, I think, originally. He wrote it for cinema, and this movie was never made, so was only published recently. Albert Camus, of course, and this one is a favorite of mine. I guess nobody knows it. It's a Brazilian contemporary author, O Mês da Gripe. It's the title, which means the month of the flu. The guy's called Valêncio Xavier, and this is an astounding novel, very experimental. I think I'm showing you in the no, not yet. We'll go back to it. But once again, the month of the flu. So again, we have a chronological placement and the idea of the influenza, okay? That thing is also observable in one particular phenomenon of the 19th century, which is the mysteries. So in 1842, Eugène Sue published Les Mystères de Paris, okay? And that is the mysteries of Paris. and that is a tremendous success. It is a huge bestseller, actually the first bestseller of the 19th century. He was like, just like Dumas, he has been forgotten, unlike Dumas, but they were friends, and they pretty much occupied the same place within French culture, the publishing popular novels for industrial consumption, let's say. So publishing like roman feuilleton, no, the serialized fiction, but with a popular intake, because almost all novels were serialized in the 1800s. That's true of Middlemarch. That's true about Anna Karenina. It took 4 years for Anna Karenina to be completely published in Russia. So everybody was serialized. But you have a certain type of serialization which is linked to very, very popular novels with, like the Penny Dreadfuls in England, which have very simple characters, very adventurous plots filled with discoveries and revelations of identity. So the good guy, suddenly you discover he's a bad guy, and the one who died suddenly is resurrected, and so on. This is a huge success, and the Mysteries of Paris is focused on the underworld of crime and dissolution of Paris. So it is about the mafia, and it doesn't have this name yet, but it's pretty much like Il Padrino, if you want. Okay, so they speak in slangs because they're criminals, so they don't want to be understood by others. So they kind of have their own language, and it's French, but it's all with slangs. So much so that other honorable citizens cannot understand. Okay, they have coded names. They don't have names. Their names are nicknames, which are based on animals, which are based on physical features. Okay, and they are very clearly a hidden threat to society. So these narratives, they cope with these anxieties of industrialization and about the sudden explosion of cities, vast crowds of poor citizens deployed of access to health, to sanitation, to leisure, and then which start to become like violence starts to erupt in towns, and every so often the crime starts to be a major anxiety and a major concern at the time. And then this is the moment in which the poor and it starts to be really widely discussed in literature. I'm referring to this study by Yves Lochard, La fortune du pauvre, parcours et discours romanesque, in which he studies thematically how the poor is represented in 19th century literature. And one thing that I find fascinating, one of his conclusions, is that if you want to talk about a poor person that is not a criminal, you have to specify it. Otherwise, if you just say poor, it is intended, like it's read in between the lines that you're actually talking about criminals. So the novels usually, and he shows that, is fascinating. The novels, when they are talking about the honest poor, they make sure you understand it, okay? There is another study by Laura Otis, which is called Metaphors of Invasion. A brilliant study, completely brilliant. And she analyzes how the detective novel is also a very 19th century phenomenon. So if we're seeing this, the threat of the poor and the threat of the criminals, we also see an equivalent, a counter phenomenon that is linked to the detective novel. So now we want to see the police go after the bad guys. And Laura Otis explores the idea that Sherlock Holmes, for example, which is based in Louis Pasteur, is based on Robert Koch, so on this very important sciences of the time. She analyzes how Sherlock Holmes is profoundly linked to science and epidemics, and also to the idea that for him, the criminal classes are pretty much the same with the poor, the lower classes, as they would call it. So you have a huge overlap between poor and criminals also in Sherlock Holmes and in many other detective stories. And one key aspect of his research is anonymity. He mentions, for example, that even the most representative of all the poor characters in 19th century literature, which is Jean Valjean, the main character of Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. So it's a central text by a central author, and this guy is amazing. And what's his name? Jean Valjean, which we could translate as John equals John, or John means John, or something of the kind. So his name is not a name. He's a no one. Okay, he's a John Doe. I think you say in English, right? The narratives of epidemics, they tend to represent anonymity as well. It's one of the fascinating things I came through with my research, which is the representation of epidemics follow very closely the representation of the poor, because epidemics, obviously they're a menace, they are a threat, and unlike the diseases of the individual, the epidemics, they come from the outside. They come from somewhere. Who gave it to me? It's all on China's fault and whatever. So all this nonsense discourses that we're hearing now, they have always existed. You have this effort to this urge to search for guilty people, to scapegoat, and then you have an enemy abroad that is the one that infected you in the first place. But you also have the enemy within, the menace, the hidden menace, the underground menace. And that enemy within are the poor, okay? So the enemy is the poor. So you see this very interesting interlacing of different types of mostly bourgeois anxieties in the 19th century, and they are very well and alive nowadays in political discourses all around, especially with so much populism going on. So just to give you a quick example, if you come back to this experimental Brazilian novel, it has no real characters. The novel, it mimics a newspaper's clips. So it's as if he had cut texts from newspapers and glued them together. Texts about the Spanish influenza of 1918. The thing is that they are all made up, and the author has took like the effort to these are all by the author. So the graphical aspect of it is an intrinsical part of the text. So it's very interesting because we are used to this combination of image and text in the realm of children's literature, for example, but it's not so common to find such a symbiotic relationship when we come to canonical literature between many quotations, because I don't really accept this division. My children's literature is amazing. But you can see here, we see the life of the city of Curitiba, which is the city I'm speaking of. I'm in here right now. And in this city in south of Brazil, he covers the whole 3 months of the influenza, and you don't have a character. The city is the character, very much like Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year. That's what we're doing 350 years later in contemporary Brazilian literature. Not talking about plague, talking about influenza. And since epidemics disrupt social rules so much, since they are anonymous, they share this feature with Carnival. They are Carnival-like, because if we remember Bakhtin and his definition of what Carnival is precisely the short amount of time, 2, 3, 4 days, perhaps 7 if you're Brazilian. we take Carnival very serious here, guys. Carnival is the moment. It is the brief amount of time, window of time, in which all rules are subverted, in which you can behave in ways that are not acceptable in other moments. And I remember that many years ago, when I was a child, there was an international band came to play in Brazil, in Rock in Rio, and one of the players, he played naked, which is a crime in Brazil. You cannot go naked in the street. And when he was arrested after the show, I think he was from the US, he was saying like, how come in the country of Carnival, I'm arrested for being naked? That doesn't make any sense. And I never forgot that, because he has a really an amazing point. How come? It's a complete paradox that you cannot go naked in the street. You cannot even go topless in the beach. But we are the country of Carnival. We have naked people all around, in TV at least. It doesn't happen. It's stereotypical as well, the way it's represented. But anyway, my point is that this event is proof that Carnival is the moment in which subversion is accepted and even encouraged in a certain sense. And that's already, we can have a glimpse of that if we look into this picture by Bruegel. Because very in the corner there, I placed the red lines for you. We can see this. We see this. Some people were having a feast and now they're being killed. One of them is fighting, and you have the musicians, a poet perhaps as well. They are completely oblivious to what is going on around them. He's playing and singing to his beloved, and they are having a thing over there. And they don't even realize that there's a skeleton playing the fiddle for them. And their time has come. They have to go, but they are oblivious to it. So the Carnival and epidemics are profoundly linked due to the disruption of social collapse in general, but also because literature is expected to give you escapism, to denounce hedonism. Okay, and this is not only happening in the Middle Ages or in the early modern period. This is also true of the 20th and 21st century. You can see here in a futurist cubist painting by Georges Gros, named The Funeral, which is an answer to the Spanish influenza. And what we can see is also a parade, a danse macabre. What we see is a triumph of death. And I want to, so much so that it's written in the building, Neue Tanz, so the new dance, right? So, no, sorry, Heute Tanz, dance tonight, right? So he is dialoguing with this tradition, but also changing it to the avant-garde, the mentality of the early 20th century. And I would like to invite you to pay a close attention to this. It's difficult to understand. We see like one character with a French flag. We see that it's a carnival, but it's a bit difficult to interpret in a short notice. You take some time to get used to it. But if we look closer to the central figure, we see this huge skeleton riding a coffin, which is death itself. It's a triumph of death, after all. But and death is drinking. She's having a great time. So the idea of enjoying getting drunk, you would not even say that it's during a pandemic. You would guess it would be like, I don't know, commemoration after World Cup or something. So the very idea of communal celebration is interwoven into the iconography of the plague, in the danse macabre, in the triumphs of death. See, this is an authentic document from the modern period. And we see this, the idea here is that the Pope, the Kaiser, the cardinals, and the common folk, they're all alike in the face of death. So plague is a huge equalizer. Plague destroys identities. Plague is anonymous by definition. It is not like this at all. Plague had a preference for poor people. They died in droves, and wealthier people usually are better nourished, and so they survived more. It's very sad, but culturally, it's not how it was perceived. It was perceived as affecting all equally. So much so that I find fascinating that the mask of the plague doctor, which is a thing which has existed, but is not as widely distributed as we are made to believe, because we have a few of them, but they were not like used all over. But anyway, it's a medical device, and it's a medical device that becomes a carnival mask. It's amazing. So it goes both ways. Carnivals inspires the plague, the depiction of the plague, but then the depiction of it, and then science offers retro feeds Carnival, and then Carnival reabsorbs this. It's fascinating. If you go to Carnival in Venice, you will see many people having this bird-like mask. And what I find even more interesting, I have a whole chapter in my PhD thesis dedicated to it, is that the blending of partying crowds. So we're talking about crowds celebrating, okay? But there are also violent crowds, the rioting crowds. And they're very, very interesting. But in 45 minutes, I don't have time. But if you want to look into that, go look at, because it's very, very interesting. When we're talking about partying crowds, the manifestation of disease, it reaches even this relationship between disease and carnival goes even beyond literature into the realm of journalism. So 2 examples for us to finish. Heinrich Heine, the German poet, was in Paris in 1832 during the first cholera outbreak. Okay, so it was the first outbreak of cholera in Paris, the first of five, I think. It was huge. Many people died. It was a huge cultural impact. And Heine wrote a quite extensive text. It's like 20 pages long or even longer, an open letter that was published in the newspapers describing this. And it's very interesting because it's Heine. I mean, Heine is hilarious. He's very, very funny, very ironic. And I laugh a lot when I read this. Many people read this seriously. And of course, he's talking about a very traumatic and tragic event. But he does with so much irony. And some of the things that he says he saw are so nonsensical that they're barely believable. I mean, that they're clearly made up. They're clearly apocryphal, or at least they're so exaggerated up to the point of becoming apocryphal. And I bring you one example, which is linked to satire and to carnival. So he's talking about the eruption of cholera in Paris. That night, the balls were more crowded than usual. Excessive laughter almost drowned the roar of music. You cannot even listen to the music. People are having so much fun. And apparently that's bad, okay? People don't have fun. People grew hot in the confusion, a dance of anything but equivocal character. All kinds of ices and cold beverages were in great demand, so people were drinking a lot. When all at once the merriest of the harlequins felt some refreshment on his legs, it est. So to say in other words, he had diarrhea, which is the main symptoms, the main symptom of cholera. He felt a refreshment in his leg. So very, very ironic and funny way to describe diarrhea. He took off his mask, surprised, and to the amazement of all, a violet blue face became visible. So cholera turns people into blue. It's called cyanosis, but that happens because you're very profoundly dehydrated. So it does not happen like that. It takes hours. And it takes a lot of diarrhea for you to become blue. So the fact that he describes things in this way already shows us that scientifically is not possible, at least not in this fashion. And the text continues like instantaneously when they see his face, very many people drop stricken by cholera as if an act of magic. They're immediately brought to the hospital. And hours later, many of them have died. And they are immediately buried in their costumes. And so much so that Heine mentions that now they live as happily in the grave as they have in their own life. So also extremely ironic, and it cannot be taken seriously. Another example, I will need 2 minutes more, guys, if that's okay. I'm about to finish my time, but I'll just show you tiny things and we're done. So another example is from Chateaubriand, the Mémoires d'Outre-Tombe, a very important text within French literature. And he swears he saw, while going in the street, so everyone kept going to theater, I saw drunkards at the Barrière Street, so he even gives you that info, sitting in front of the tavern's door, drinking on a small wooden table, and saying as they raised their glasses, to the health, Morbus. So they were toasting to cholera. And Morbus, out of gratitude, rushed up and they felt that under the table. So They make a toast to cholera, how bad they are. And they drink, and when they drink, they all fall dead. It doesn't happen that easily. Cholera is very swift. Cholera can kill you in a matter of hours, that's true. But it is not like a heart attack. It's not fulminating like that. So we know that there is a huge tradition about this. There is a tendency to exaggerate in literature and also in journalism. There is not much of a division there. And I think one of the reasons for that is that the carnival being mixed up with the plague legitimizes interpretations of plague as punishment. So these people, they are clearly irresponsible, and they are somehow unhuman, because it's human to fear annihilation. So it's very weird that somebody would be like suicidally, if they want to kill themselves, they could. So why would they wait for the plague to do so? So if they don't have a death wish, and the fact that they're toasting to it and collapsing shows us a feature that, in my interpretation at least, it's hardly credible, at least to the extent that it appears in literature. So I think it works as a tool to legitimize interpretations of heavenly punishment. And this is well preserved in the literature of the 20th century. There is this novel that is astonishing by a Polish writer, Bruno Joshenski. It's an avant-garde text published in the end of the 1920s, and it's brilliant. I love this. I was so angry that I've never heard about it before my PhD, because it's in a great novel. I urge you to read it. And what you have is an outbreak of plague, and people were dancing jazz, and people dropped dead, but the others continued dancing because the music is just so good. Okay. To finish, I want to show you a little part of Faust by Murnau. Faust, can you see the video? Is it playing? I cannot read. Is it playing for you guys?
Yes.
Okay. It's just some seconds. So we have a carnival. We have a circus. Mephisto sends the miasmas, which cause the plague. And the person falls. Okay. But look how interesting. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Look now, the face. So the way for them to recognize the plague is not by buboes, is not by looking into the symptoms of the plague, is through the face, just like cholera, just like Heine. So this is very interesting because this gets into the tradition, okay? The very same thing is found in the remake of Nosferatu by Herzog. The same thing, in which you have this final scene, for example, in which she's going to face Dracula, which is Nosferatu, right? And you have this people enjoying themselves. And we're talking about a remake that was made like 50 years ago, okay? So that is a tradition that is alive and well. And that is also related to other types of disaster studies, like those depicted by Svetlana Alexievich, okay? This is a mosaic of the descriptions of people that were affected by the Chernobyl explosion, and it's very interesting. They are clearly identified, but the overall effect is anonymous. It's collective. So, to my astonishment, narratives of epidemics, they have more relationship to this kind of disaster studies than with texts on tuberculosis. And my point is precisely because of this superposition of anonymity and epidemic disease. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry for taking 2 or 3 minutes more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aurelio, for this exciting lecture. I think that in Greece, at least, we are ready to behave like the people in your last examples. We need just, a click, and then we'll be like them. And as it's spring now, it's very easy for us to go out and forget all the measures we have to follow for this pandemic. Anyway, I found your presentation really inspiring and really nice. So I think it's time for comments and questions. If anybody would like to say something or ask Aureo for his presentation, we are ready.
And just to add, if anyone prefers to type a question in the chat, we can also take questions that way as well as by people asking them directly.
Oh, we have comments in Portuguese. Thank you, Maria. It's a pleasure. One of the things that I find fascinating while people may be typing about this type of research is that in a certain ways, it's a bit exhausting to be living through a pandemic. But I've been studying this topic for like 4 or 5 years now. And in a certain sense, it's very interesting to be living through a pandemic as well, because the very same patterns of behavior, of reasoning, we tend to see ourselves as so developed and so technological, and people in the past seem so weird and so primitive at times. And then this thing comes up and shows us that that is all nonsense, that there is a huge human tendency in the way we react. There's we react by patterns in a certain sense. Although we would like to see ourselves as so special and different, we're not special and different at all. So it's a very humbling experience, I think. It's quite interesting.
Aureo, may I ask a question?
Sure.
So first of all, just to say, I enjoyed that enormously, and I'm thoroughly convinced by your distinction between individual sickness and group representations of group sickness in the arts. And I guess I wanted to ask whether the carnivalesque element comes into the creative literature as well as the journalistic literature, and we saw it. You showed it very well in the painting as well. I suppose the example I was thinking of that I even wonder whether it's derived from that Heine quotation is actually The Mask of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe, which seems to really bring that together. And then also, of course, the film of that too by Roger Corman in the 60s. But I wonder whether there are other examples. Is there that carnivalesque element in Defoe or in Camus or any of those other places?
Yes. I would say that almost it's a topos. Nearly all the plague texts, and not only, because the cholera texts do the same, the typhus texts do the same. All these texts of epidemics, at some point, 90% of them will have at least an indirect reference to some type of carnival. It was very well remembered, like the Mask of the Red Death is partially inspired in a text by Nathaniel Parker Willis, which published a letter describing to the American public the cholera outbreak of Paris, the very same one that Heine describes. And Parker Willis probably kind of paraphrased and took some inspiration from Heine in the first place, but he's making the mediation between this European public and the public in the USA. And this text was edited by Poe himself, was published in the newspaper in which Poe was an editor. And so clearly the Mask of the Red Death, it's related to the plague, right? The Black Death, and the references to Prince Prospero and to the 1,000 aristocrats, which is actually making us think of the 10 aristocrats of the Decameron. Is just a more exaggerated figure. So there are relationships to the plague, but there are also several symptoms connected to cholera. For example, the Red Death, cholera was called the Blue Death. There is the fact that they see the face of the Red Death and then they recognize it. There is the fact that the Red Death kills you in 30 minutes, while cholera takes a few hours. Plague takes 3 to 4 days, sometimes more, to kill a person. So cholera was very distinctive, that it looked like a heart attack, that people could just drop that. And so the Mask of the Red Death is definitely an answer to cholera. Poe almost died of cholera. We have to remember that. We have letters in which he describes his experience with cholera. So the fact that this personal, the text is written before his personal experience with cholera, but the fact that he combines both tradition and his text is all about carnival, it's a very indicative. And you see this in, for example, Oaths and Poles, or in which you have also commemoration. You see this in Eugène Sue. After the Mysteries of Paris, he published another novel which is called Le Juif Errant, so the Wandering Jew. And the Wandering Jew is the one to bring cholera to France. So it's very interesting because these metaphors of the Jew as intrinsically diseased, as syphilitic, as bringing the plague, that these metaphors will be profoundly explored by the Nazis in the 30s and 40s. And these ideas are actually, they predate the Nazis, because the novel is not so racist, it's not so prejudiced. Of course, it is to some extent, but it's not Nazi in this sense. But you can see that you have to blame the Jew for bringing cholera. And in that, you have a huge chapter that is dedicated, once again, to carnival. They dress like cholera. So it's very interesting. You see it pretty much all around. In Manzoni's I Promessi Sposi, which is the betrothed in English, I believe, in which you have the rioting crowds. And when you don't have carnival, you have the riots. Then you have this usually poor people out of their minds looking for someone to beat and kill. Yeah. So Macdom has asked it here in the chat, can you comment on the epidemic and collective fear as appears in the literature? Definitely, thank you for the question. Fear it's extremely relevant for the representation of epidemics in general. And I would say it's even something conditioning the writing about the topic. Well, my point is that in my research, I was surprised by the fact that it takes some time for people to look behind and then start to talk about it. It's very symbolic that the text about the plague has come in the 20th century, not in the 15th, not in the, of course, we have a journal of the plague year, which is amazing. But I think the first text that comes to most people's minds when we talk about the plague is Camus. And that is published in 1947. So a lot of time has to pass before we feel free to wash our dirty clothes, let's say. So this is also true about cholera. When cholera thrives for the first time, it is seen as a new disease. There's a huge discussion if cholera was actually new or not among historians, but culturally it was seen both as a continuation of the plague and as a new disease coming from India. But very, India was linked to the Britain. It was politically and economically was kind of bad to represent cholera solely as Indian. So actually cholera becomes Asiatic. We are in the heyday of Orientalism. And so cholera is at once Muslim, Indian, Chinese, somehow, sometimes even related to the Americas, right? So it's very interesting because Asiatic cholera actually means anywhere in the globe besides Europe. And so this correlation is very strong. And when cholera arrives and it's new, the fear is tremendous. And so very few literary texts discuss cholera immediately. It takes a few years. And when they do, usually they go back to the Middle Ages and they go back to the plague. So they don't talk about cholera. Very representative of this is a theater play by Pushkin which is called A Feast in the Time of Plague. And I have also one chapter talking about this in my PhD thesis, because Pushkin wrote this play, actually translated from another play and adapted it by a Scottish writer. He wrote this play while in quarantine, cholera quarantine. He was isolated for 5 months in the Russian countryside. He went there to check his farm, let's say, and in the moment he was to go back to Moscow, the cholera quarantine was erupted and he could not go back. And so he was isolated, and he was truly alone in this farm for 5 months. And in this period, he wrote a lot. He finished the Onegin, he finished many essays. And he wrote this play that is called The Feast in the Time of the Plague, but actually was written during the cholera pandemic. And it's actually ambience in the Middle Ages during the plague. So it's very, very common. Very, very common. That's why, in my understanding, there is cholera actually brings about a renewal of plague within literature. In my argument, the plague texts, they start to decrease little by little, and then you have a resurgence in the 19th century of plague texts talking about the plague in the Middle Ages. But actually, this resurgence is connected to cholera. And one, I've shown one of them, the text by Jens Peter Jacobsen, The Plague in Bergamo. It's actually written during cholera. Another text by Flaubert, La Peste en Florence, The Plague in Florence, is written during 6 years after the cholera outbreak of Paris. So there are many, many links between plague texts and cholera texts. It's fascinating. Annalisa, thank you for the comment. She said, can you comment on epidemic and isolation? The plague in Boccaccio's Decameron functions as a frame whereby these young people isolate themselves to escape contagion. And yes, that's totally true. And that is also one of the interesting things that authors use epidemics for. Very, very often, epidemic diseases, they only offer a background to justify the killing of a character or the isolation of a group. So when you read The Magic Mountain, you realize that the sanitarium, the Berghof, that sanitarium is a microcosmos of the world, right? It is, or at least of Europe and of the European intelligentsia. So you have bourgeois, you have the aristocrats, you have people from all over Europe speaking many languages, having very intellectual discussions on different trends of counter-reformism when we're talking about NAFTA, and enlightenment and humanism when we're talking about Settembrini. So you have this huge placing together of the pan-European culture and at the same time European history, okay, or at least intellectual history. It works as a microcosm, and epidemics often work in the same manner. So and very often they are used to either show how humans are terrible and we all kill each other when we are isolated, or to show some type of locus amenus, some type of idyllical environment which is perfect. So we either go to complete dystopia or complete utopia. And that's what we have in the Decameron. It's fascinating that they isolate themselves for 10 days. If we do the math, guys, the plague won't be finished in 10 days. It will not work, this isolation. So clearly, it doesn't make any sense. Pragmatically, the point of isolation is to create this environment in which they can have dinners and recitate poetry and enjoy themselves in the garden. Okay, this paradise. On the other hand, we have novels like Ensaio sobre a Cegueira, for example, The Blindness by the Portuguese Nobel Prize José Saramago. And in there we have this new disease, this epidemic of white blindness, and you have some people that are locked up in a hospital, and they start like immediately like to fall off and kill each other, and there's raping, and there's many bad things happen. And you have this kind of dystopia approach. Sometimes you even have a mixing of the two. For example, in Margaret Atwood's the Mad Adam trilogy, which is fascinating because you have a new virus that is distributed through a drug, actually, that is designed in laboratory to kill human beings, because this very same scientist has created a new kind of beings that are perfected, and they live in perfect harmony with the environment. So he wants to create utopia through dystopia. So you have an utopia within a dystopia. You have the idea of the paradisic garden, so the garden of paradise, overlapping the idea of the terrible hospital of terror from Saramago. Both of them are together in Margaret Atwood. So there are many possibilities to explore. Anastasia, thank you for the question. She asked, she mentioned about the genocide going on in Brazil, right? We have a president that is a denier of science and an anti-vaxxer. So things are very preoccupied over here. And our first health minister was actually fired because he was doing such a great job and getting such good rates of applause. And then the president felt threatened and dismissed him. So situation is really bad. It truly, sometimes I look to my studies in the Middle Ages with some missing it a little bit. We would be better if we were in the Middle Ages. Quite often I feel that when I look into Brazilian politics. So the question is if there is a sense of merriment and of carnival after the crisis has passed. I would say no. On general terms, it does not, because as soon as the crisis is finished, we forget about it. This kind of disasters, they are too abrupt. We see them as anomalies. They are not anomalies. We're not living the new normal. This is the normal, people. Okay. This is the normal. This has been the normal throughout the whole of the history of humankind. And we better get used to, because we're destroying the planet, and the collapse of the ecosystem will make such things much worse. We don't have to look for China to China for if we want to look for scapegoating, we should not look to China. We should look into capitalism. Okay, and the destruction of natural resources and everything, and but that is too complicated. It's too difficult to fix. So we prefer to create this simple storytelling in which one little thing, if they didn't eat the bad soup, oh la la, we would not have such a problem. And that's a myth in the first place, anyway. So my reading is that there is a tendency to forget about it once the thing is finished. So much so that the Spanish influenza has been called by Crosby, the great historian, Alfred Crosby, has written a text called The Forgotten Pandemic, because we know about it now, but 3 years ago, if you speak about the influenza pandemic, nobody really knew what we're talking about. So we tend to forget it. And that is even true about other types of disasters. There is a fascinating texts about climate change. Don't even think about it. I don't remember the name of the author, sorry. And I was amazed while reading it to find that disaster victims don't want to talk about climate change. They actually are less prone to believe in climate change. These people had their lives destroyed by hurricanes and other weather phenomena linked to climate change, and still they not only do not accept it, but the rates of acceptance that climate change is caused by human action they're lower. They don't want to talk about it in the first place, and they don't believe it in the second place. And that is related to a psychological coping strategy. And that's very sad, because we will not learn the lesson. We will not. I'm very pessimistic about it. If we were capable of learning the lesson, we would have learned several centuries ago. I mean, unfortunately, I don't think we are very well equipped to deal either with the future pandemics, or which there will come and there will be worse, or with climate change overall. I think we have to try, of course, but don't let my pessimism affect you. But I'm a bit skeptical. Thank you very much. Let me see if you have more questions. Just one thing I forgot. Usually when they come back, discourses about diseases, they're not about disease. So one example is Camus' La Peste, which is written about in a reply to a metaphorical plague, right? So it's the plague of fascism, it's the plague of Nazism, very, very contemporary, right? And so this is interesting. The resurgence of the plague is linked to social phenomena rather than the biological phenomena. And Camus is the only one discussed usually, but he's not the only one by far. We have Lagerkvist in Scandinavia writing, for example, The Dwarf, which is a brilliant text. He won the Nobel Prize. We have texts by Hesse, Nazis und Goldmund, which is also a brilliant text. Published in the 30s. So we already see this tendency, like fascism kind of invites memories from collapse and the plague, and etc.
Ariel, may I ask a question?
Of course, Emmy, sure.
Actually, I would like to speak in Portuguese, because I don't think I'm gonna elaborate the question in English
Okay.
as well.
I can translate afterwards. Cool. That's cool.
Thank you. Eu sou jornalista e eu, assim, tô fascinada pelo teu trabalho. E
Obrigado.
enquanto eu pude ouvir teus comentários, me ocorreu uma questão interessante. Assim, tu faz essa análise literária, né, e histórica dos textos, de tudo que a gente tem aí, para conseguir compreender o que foi que aconteceu no passado, né, da saúde, da história da saúde de uma maneira geral. Mas o que tu já pensaste a respeito do que é que a gente está deixando hoje em termos de texto, sabe? Eu digo isso porque os historiadores utilizam muito os registros midiáticos, né, da história, de jornais, essas coisas assim, para compor, né, o que estava acontecendo no momento. E eu acho que a gente está vivendo um momento muito curioso em relação a isso. Eu queria entender o que é que tu pensa, se tu já pensou a respeito do que está ficando para os historiadores do futuro, sabe? De como que esse momento vai ser compreendido, assim, com base nessa fonte.
Não, beleza, uma pergunta excelente, Amy. Obrigado. So Amy was asking about how historians will look into the texts produced now during the coronavirus pandemic, both in the media and artistic-wise as well, if I understood you correctly, Amy. So very interesting, very relevant question. I think future historians will be overwhelmed with information. Okay, they have a lot of things to study, both real and imaginary. If we think about it, we are living in the world of fiction. Like half of the information, if not more, that is going on through the pandemic, it's actually fake and it's fictional. So in a certain sense, we're living the literature. We're living inside a fictional world, in a certain sense, if you wish. There's a very interesting book by Sonia Shah called The Next Pandemic, from Plague to Ebola and Beyond, I think this is the title. And she puts forward a very interesting argument that cholera is very relevant because it is the first pandemic to leave a paper trace, a paper trail. So the Black Death, or a Black Death usually refers to Europe, right? If we think about the second plague pandemic, which ravaged the old continents, this second plague pandemic has left very few texts, and we need genetics. That's why we knew so little about it since 20 years ago. We were not even sure it was bubonic plague. So now we are sure due to genetics. So we needed new tools. We needed technology to look into the past. To the past. There's people that even questions the fact that China was ravaged by plague in the Middle Ages as well. In my reading, I was convinced by scholars that argue that it does, but some people argue that it's not. And I don't have the expertise to go into the question, but I side with one school of thought. I was convinced by them. Cholera is completely different. Cholera arises in the 19th century, which is the century in which statistics is born, in which epidemiology is born. And epidemiology is the blending, is in the intersection between statistics and health. So due to this, cholera is described in rivers of paint, like rivers of paper flow to describe cholera. The amount of medical treatises is truly immense. And it appears a lot in literature. Nobody has ever paid attention to it, so we don't even realize it. But very often when we're talking about, I remember when I was talking with John several years ago, we were in Paris at this dinner that he mentioned in the beginning, and we started talking about Middlemarch. And I was like, yeah, when there's cholera in Middlemarch. And it was like, so actually it was cholera. I didn't pay attention to that. And John is a great scholar. And the thing is that it doesn't give us, it doesn't mean anything. If it's cholera, plague, or typhus, we don't care. We just remember that there is an epidemic, and that's it. You see, so, but when we start to look for that specific question, we see it all around in literature. Sonia Shaw argues that cholera is the historical basis for us to study the next pandemic. This book is like 10 years old, so it predates even SARS perhaps, but certainly predates COVID. And so I think the historians of the future, we have so much info, but both real and imagined. That's a thing. I do think that for a while we will forget about the pandemic, generally, collectively, as a society. But I do think that after a few years, we're going to see literary texts describing this experience. But I think it will take some time because, come on, would you guys read a novel about COVID right now? I think not. Rebecca made this point last lecture, and I totally agree with her. I think we're so fed up with all that, and reality is so scary already that we would rather watch series in Netflix and think about something else. Okay. Thank you, Amy, for the question. I don't know if we still have time. George, Sadek has written also here.
I think
Sorry,
we
guys,
have
speak
some
so
time.
much.
I think Sadek is asking something, and also Aldir, what is the current situation in China? Because you mentioned China before.
Okay.
Something when you talk about climate change, like that.
Sure. Thank you, George. So I'll try to be brief, okay?
Excuse
Yes,
me, Auro. Excuse me. Could I ask a question, please, in Portuguese?
Sure.
Ok. Eu estava tentando achar aqui num livro que eu li sobre plantas, quando fala da quina, ou daquela substância, né? E aí ele menciona muito sobre a malária. E ele aponta, assim, essa doença como que umas doenças que mais dizimou uma população na história. Você confirma essa informação? Seria mais ou menos assim?
Sim. So, é tudo, Aldir?
Yeah.
Obrigadão pela pergunta, então. Obrigado. Thank you, Aldir. So his question is that he was reading about malaria, and the book mentioned that malaria is the biggest killer of all of human beings ever. I do agree with that. I think that's arguable because malaria still kills a lot of people. Okay, a lot of people. There was such a commotion about Zika a few years ago. Like, oh my God, there's a global emergency, a new virus coming from the forest, the deep forest of Brazil. You see that it always comes from somewhere off the hidden track, right? It comes from the crazy soup, the bat soup from China. It comes from the equatorial dark jungles of Brazil. It comes from the dark jungles of Congo. It's always somewhere that is imagined as telluric, is imagined as other, as out of civilization, primitive somehow. Okay, so that being said, the Zika cases were 5,500. Okay, and still the United Nations declared an emergency, not a pandemic, but an emergency. That same year, about over 1 million people died of malaria. How many times have you opened a newspaper with the headlines, "Little kid dies of malaria"? Never. Why? Because it happens the whole time. Malaria is a huge scourge, huge. And precisely because of that, paradoxically, we don't care. So it's very interesting. It's very, very interesting. We are very afraid of sharks. We take a lot of care with things that are unlikely to kill us, but we drive while writing in WhatsApp, and that most certainly will kill you. Do not do that. People are fighting for the right of go out of their houses without the mask, which can kill them. But then they are afraid of taking the vaccine because perhaps there is a tiny chance that they will have some counter. So human beings are very paradoxical and very illogical at times, especially when it comes to a threat. And the thing about malaria is that not only malaria kills a lot of people, but malaria is super extremely old. Okay, we are not sure how old the plague is. We're not sure how old smallpox is, but it would be in the range of a few thousand years old. Okay, malaria it's dozens, if not hundreds of thousands of years old. So much so that we have 4 genetic markers in our genome that are resulting from malaria. So we have in the genome, malaria has constricted human evolution. So if we think throughout the whole of history, malaria is very likely the biggest killer. Even though in the 20th century alone, smallpox probably killed 300 million people, okay? Smallpox. And people don't want to get vaccinated. How incredible is that? But still, this number, even the huge numbers of deaths by the plague in Europe, it's calculated that about 75 million died in Europe in the Middle Ages. Some people put this number higher, but 75 million people. That pales in comparison to what malaria could have achieved throughout human history. Okay, it depends on how you count. Thank you, Aldir.
Thanks a lot. Sorry, excuse me again. I have another question about malaria. I'm going to speak in Portuguese. No livro que eu li também está dizendo que uma informação que parece que é contraditória, controversa, mas ele aponta para que, no sentido de que a enfermidade não surgiu nas Américas, na América do Sul, né, entre os índios, que ela teria surgido na Europa mesmo. Né? Então, existem estudos sobre esse assunto e se essa realmente foi assim, onde foi a origem da malária? Onde que ela apareceu pela primeira vez?
Ótima pergunta. Ótima pergunta, obrigado. So Aldir was asking about the origins of malaria specifically, if it is a new world disease or an old world disease. There's much discussion, not only about malaria, but about many diseases, because it's very interesting. Tuberculosis is simply tuberculosis, but cholera is Asiatic cholera, right? Coronavirus, Trump and Bolsonaro, they insist and calling it the Chinese flu, the Kung flu, and whatever, all these racist terms designed to blame and to assign some maliciousness to it. That is very typical of epidemics. And then the discussions get very heated when it comes to academia, because we have to know where these diseases came from. They all come from somewhere. Sometimes we're able to see it, sometimes we're not. HIV, for example, it's sad, but scientifically we know by genomics that it does arise in Africa, somewhere in equatorial forests in the Central Africa, probably around 1890 and 1920. Okay, so we can even cut down like the chronological window, and we know that we know that for very good reasons, linked to genetics, but also other tools as well. Of course, there's so much racism connected to Africa, and Africans are unfairly portrayed in the media as very often as primitive and as sick, as diseased and whatever. So there's so much, there's such a huge heritage of racist and imperialist science behind this. We have to admit, science was a huge tool of empire, okay? Europe could not have conquered the world without science at its ranks. That is very clear, and many, many historians point to that. So when nowadays we get to the conclusion that HIV is probably started in Africa, many people get indignated by that, and rightly so, because that will reinforce stereotypes and racist assumptions about Africans. And that is true about any disease. That is true about the origins of coronavirus. Perhaps it is coming from China. We don't know. It could be, okay? But even if it is, China denies it. China even tried to blame India recently, because China doesn't want that attached to its name. And that is also that is true of anything. That is also true. And the New World was decimated by diseases. What we call the Colombian Exchange was the unification of the global biosphere starting at the 16th century, in the moment in which there was an exchange of ecosystems, animals, plants, and minerals. And minerals were pretty much, you could find them all over, but especially plants and animals and diseases, because they are part of the ecosystem. They are living beings, okay? They are tiny, they're invisible, but they are animals of a sort. And so the unification of the ecosystems of the old world and the new world had many, many, many effects. And one of them is that you have devastative waves of epidemics that erased the population of the Americas. Only after the 1970s that historians started to look into that. And that's why we have slavery in the first place. Why we have why do we have a transatlantic slave trade? Why they would bother to go that far in Africa to forcibly enslave people and bring these enslaved people to the Americas, so far away, so expensive, so laborious. Why? Because they could not enslave the Native Americans. The Native Americans died easily of diseases, and they had more knowledge of the environment, so they had an advantage. And so because of that, because they all died in a very short period by smallpox, diphtheria, typhoid, etc., many diseases that Europeans brought, you had such a huge thing, such an important thing as the transatlantic slave trade. So to answer your question briefly, malaria is sometimes, I'm not very, very sure about malaria. Very often it is mentioned as a disease that arose in Africa because it's so old, okay? So in order to condition the human genome, it is very, very, very likely from Africa. It makes a lot of sense to me, since human beings first arose in Africa, and the whole of the Americas were only occupied about 15,000 years ago, so it could not evolve into the Americas. That by itself, I believe it's a very good argument, but I would not put my finger in it because I'm not a specialist on this issue specifically. Okay, thank you. George, we're done. Sorry, guys, I'm so prolific. I'm sorry. Sadek still has a question.
I
Tell
don't
me.
think we have another question right now, Aurel,
Oh,
but I must say that we are thrilled from your presentation and the energy you saw during expression of your arguments. And I think most of us, if not all of us, we share the same opinion like you, at least today.
thank you, George. Ευχαριστώ πάρα
Uh,
πολύ.
I also would like to thank very much all our friends and colleagues from Brazil, because I saw that there were many with us today. And a great hello to everybody in Brazil. You know, Aurel knows that because he was in Greece. Brazilians and Greeks have the same
Are
spirit.
very similar. That's true.
Yes.
That's
So-
true. Two countries, very similar culture.
Yes, only the language is different, I think. Otherwise,
Okay.
we could be the same. Anyway, I would like to thank you again and everybody. And I would like to pass the floor to John to conclude this meeting, if he likes.
Thank you very much, George, and thank you again, Ario, from me and from us all for a fantastic, extremely animated and engaging talk, and a wonderful, rich discussion afterwards. I'd like to just remind everybody that we have these meetings are happening the third Wednesday of every month, and the next one I'm going to put into the chat the title and the speaker. This is going to be Lucas Engelmann from Edinburgh. Let me copy this over into the chat. And he's going to be speaking on the 21st of April on the title, The Outbreak Narrative in the Science of Epidemics. And he's going to look again, another very, very wide chronological span, plague, AIDS, and COVID-19. George, I don't know if you've got the link for that at the moment, but if you have, you could put it in the chat. Otherwise, we'll be circulating it round, and then
Yes, we'll circulate it, John. We don't have the link right now.
Fantastic. So we'll circulate these links round. So that's on the 21st of April, and then we've got Pablo Mukherjee from Warwick and Martin Willis from Cardiff, who will be giving our talks in May and in June. So I very much hope you can join us then. And all I would have one last thank you for Ario for a fantastic talk, and I hope you'll be able to join us for the rest of the series too. And I look forward to picking up our conversations in person as soon as we possibly can.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I'm glad to have you here. It was an honor. Thank you very much. See you next time.
Okay. See you, everybody. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
See you guys. Bye-bye.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Obrigado, Aldir. George, can I leave as well, or will this mess up the recording?
No, it's okay. You can leave, Aurel. I'll send you the recording with WeTransfer, okay?
Ah, that's great. That's great, because some people asked me that they could not since
Yes,
it's morning.
of
Many people are working. Thank you very much, George. Once again,
Thank you very much,
such a
Aurel.
great
It was
pleasure.
fantastic. We really enjoyed it.
A great hug for you guys in Greece. And take care, okay?
Take care also too.
See you guys. Take care. Take care.
See you, Aldir. Thank you for the questions, okay? If you have anything, just write me in the Instagram and everything. We chat over there. See ya. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.